This title slide we've got is maybe a little bit dated because of the fact that we've got snow going on and everything, but it still is a big question. What is going to happen for this coming year? In the here and now, I wanted to make sure that I showed this because this is how things are looking here in central Missouri. Usually I don't do this much of a localized weather report, but when you have a storm that could bring around a foot of snow, you got to pay attention to that. And while we're just taking a quick look at that, they did have record snow in the Texas Panhandle yesterday, with Amarillo having 19 inches of snow and 10 or more inches of snow from Hereford, Texas to Beaver, Oklahoma, in the Oklahoma Panhandle, with 77-mile-an-hour winds. And this leads to the question about, has the pattern changed? What does this mean as far as soil moisture going into the growing season and so forth? And that gets into a real back and forth between the way things are shaping up in the weather outlook and what we have heard from USDA and the Ag Outlook Forum last week. But I do want to start in terms of actual drought discussion with a look at where we were, where we are right now. And at this point, we still have a pretty rip-roaring drought going on over just about the entire Corn Belt, over the western half to two-thirds of the region. We have seen some improvement over the eastern Corn Belt, as you can see. The white on the drought monitor indicates drought-free conditions. But there still is a big question about what the soil moisture supply is looking like. And we're coming off a year when temperatures were either their record hottest or second hottest in just about everywhere that you can think of. We had Iowa had its hottest, or its second hottest year. We had Nebraska, Missouri, Illinois with the hottest year ever. And we know what that did as far as our yields are concerned. How significant a drought did we have going on? Well, drought areas, fourth largest in terms of moderate to extreme drought this last year. That was the fourth largest in history going back to about 1895. That's when weather records really started to be compiled and well cataloged. Take a look at this past year's drought in 2012. Fourth largest area in moderate to extreme drought in the history, at about 58%. Where's 1990 or 1988? It's basically right about here. We pretty well put 1988 into a footnote category in terms of drought history, and I know that to a lot of us, including me, this was a real gut punch because whenever in past years when I've gone to meetings and talked about how things are shaping up for the growing year, people were asking, yeah, Bryce, that's interesting, but what about 1988? Is this going to be another 1988? Well, we put 1988 into the back seat just a little bit. And now we're going to talk about, are we going to have another 2012, in subsequent years? Well, look at the comparison. We are now in league with the mid-1950s. And then before that, in the late 1930s, and then of course the real hallmark drought in the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl. Precipitation-wise, the moisture this past year, we were obviously well below normal. And here in Missouri, we had our 7th driest month on record. In some other areas in Nebraska and Wyoming, they had the driest month going. But we had top 10 dryness. And this is obviously a big point of contention as we look ahead to the crop season and what it's going to mean for yields. A little bit closer to home, I really had to do a double take when I pulled this comparison together, because it just reminded me that things really dried up in Missouri in a big-time fashion this last year. It just is a reminder of what happened. I mean, a year ago, we had some abnormally dry conditions around Springfield and Joplin. But this year, except for the Boot Heel and portions of southeast Missouri, we are still dealing with some pretty dry conditions. And then from northwest Missouri south, kind of all the way through the western rim of the state, looking at severe drought or stage 2 drought going on. So there still is quite a bit of dryness to take care of. We have had a little bit of soil moisture recharge, but it hasn't been a real great extent yet. You're looking here at the water year precipitation from October the 1st through now. October the 1st, it's a pretty good time to think about the start of the soil moisture recharge, because by that time we're in harvest, of course. The native grasses have gone dormant, and the leaves on the trees have gone into their fall stage, and the leaves are dropping off the trees. So any moisture that we get, and we haven't frozen the ground yet, hopefully, any moisture we get is going to pretty well percolate into the soil moisture profile. So we've had several areas, and this light kind of yellowish color indicates where we've had around average moisture recharge right in here, and then just west of Jeff City, more toward Warrensburg, and then northward, we've had some above normal moisture, but there still are quite a few areas in the northwest, portions of south central, east central Missouri, still looking below normal in most of the states. So we've had some recharge, but not a whole lot. And around the country, there still is quite a bit of work that needs to be done in that respect. And this is where we call into question some of the, in our view, rather lofty yield projections that USDA discussed a week ago. And we'll go into that as we go along here. But over the eastern and the central part of the Corn Belt, we've had some improvement in Illinois, southeast Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, portions of Indiana. So they have had some. Actually, the best recharge has been here over the far northern plains in Montana and North Dakota. But then in the northwestern belt here in Iowa to Minnesota, not very much. And from Nebraska and south into Texas. Now, this will improve a little bit after this week, but they still have got a long ways to go. And then in Missouri, we are near to below normal, as we talked about. Just a little bit of a reminder. This is how things are looking as far as dry riverbeds go. And in Gilbertville, Iowa, the Cedar River, that's in eastern Iowa, as a reminder, just as an example, this picture could be taken over a number of stream beds. But as recently as 2 weeks ago, you could still see the river bed. This is not common. It's common where I'm from, in central Nebraska, from time to time. But in eastern Iowa, not really. So that's a reminder, just an example of the kind of dryness we're trying to work out of. Now, over the next 5 days, this is where the idea of a real have and have not rainfall pattern or precipitation pattern really starts to take place when you're thinking about the Corn Belt. And as we go through the rest of this season, in our view, we are going to see that. A real have and have not, because from Missouri on eastward, anywhere from around 1 inch to 1.5 inches of precipitation. I think that's pretty promising for the crop season here in Missouri. Farther to the northwest, in western Iowa to Minnesota, then into Nebraska and South Dakota, and the southwestern plains, not so much. So the big snowstorm that I just talked about in Amarillo, well, is it going to be followed up with a whole lot of moisture? Not likely. Our jet stream track in the next 10 days looks like it's going to resume a pattern that we saw in a real dominant fashion over quite a bit of last fall up until December, and then from time to time in January and February. We had a little bit more of an active southern jet stream, but the main track in the next week looks to be out of the northwest, that northwesterly airflow. That's not a good pattern as far as bringing moisture on a continual basis into the central part of the country. And that's the issue here. We tend to get locked into looking at an individual storm like we have today and think, by golly, we got this thing taken care of. Who is this Drought guy? He's just trying to scare us. We would like to think that there's a complete pattern change, but right now there is not. And that's something that we are going to be, very cautious of as we go through this coming season. The snowfall that they've gotten in the southern plains will help some, but this is what the wheat in Kansas looked like going into the heart of the winter season. When wheat going into dormancy is so thin that you can see the rows, that's not a whole lot of real branching out. That's not really the kind of productive look you want to see. And the market has a way of kind of forgetting that for a while. I think if we don't get the supplemental moisture that is really needed, I think the trade will catch up with some of that eventually. Soil moisture rankings, we are either average in the southeastern half of the state or below over the northwestern half of the state. Farther to our north in Iowa and then into the northwestern Corn Belt, they are in the lowest 10%. So that is how dry they are. And remember, some of this increase in corn acreage that you're hearing about in terms of the 2013 crop season, where's a lot of that coming from? It's coming from the Dakotas and Minnesota. You're talking about ground that had been in spring wheat or maybe some other, kind of smaller, smaller quantity crop going into corn. That's where a lot of that increase is coming from. Certainly things are better over the southeastern part of the Corn Belt, but here in the northwestern belt, there's some big production areas where things are still pretty much on the dry side. The temperature outlook in the next 3 months, certainly on a warm track over just about the entire eastern 3/4 of the country, except for the northwest. As far as the moisture is concerned, we're going to see some improvement in Missouri, along with areas to our east, in the Great Lakes through the Ohio Valley. And that's where, we are confident that we're going to have a better crop year by quite a ways than we did last year. But still, is there going to be the kind of belt-wide improvement that leads to the kind of production that's being talked about with that 14 billion bushels? That's where the big question is, because over the eastern Corn Belt and here in parts of the central and western belt, some improvement above normal, but no more than about basically normal in some of these driest areas in the northwest. And I think that's a real big question there. Now the drought outlook, I want to touch on this a little bit. Here's the seasonal drought outlook from NOAA, from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And as you look at it, you see areas in Iowa and Illinois and Wisconsin and so forth in the green, and you see a little hatched red and green in Iowa and most of Missouri, northward into Minnesota. So you see that the tag there is for improvement. Well, I want to explain that a little bit, because the threshold, the bar for success or for validation of the forecast is rather generous. You're talking here about an improvement in drought category of one classification, one time in a period of 3 months. And so, for example, here in south central Minnesota right now, this area is in stage 3 drought. That's extreme drought. So one category of improvement would be for south central Minnesota to go to severe drought one time, sometime between now and late April, early May. That's not really replenishing the soil moisture profile. And for the kind of production that is being talked about, you need to have something, otherwise you're dependent on, what, 20 to 22 inches of rain, or rainfall plus irrigation during the growing season itself. That's a real tall order in terms of the rainfall patterns. Now the Palmer Drought Index has some history to it that I think is important to keep in mind. And that is this. As you see, the Palmer Drought values as of about mid-February, they stayed pretty much the same. Were rather extensive, obviously to the dry side over the western part of the Corn Belt in a -3 to a -4 category. And now that's where this chart comes into play. What I'm pointing out here with this graphic is that since 1895, we've heard that year before, since 1895 there have been 12 times when the Palmer Drought Index on a national basis went to a -4 or below, 12 times. In each of those 12 times, it took at least 18 months, not an average, but at the minimum was 18 months to get that value back to near normal or to around 0. Here in the U.S., we went to a -4 or below on the Palmer Drought scale in July of last year. And if you apply that 18-month minimum, you're talking about January of 2014 before we really start to pull out of this dry scenario. That's why that graphic that I showed, way back when now, with the drought this past year covering the 4th largest area in moderate to extreme drought, that's why that's so important, because we think now not about some of the occurrences we've had in the last 10, 15 years. We're thinking, or 20 years, we're thinking about now in a comparison to the mid-1950s. That was a multi-year scenario that it took a while to get out of. That's what we're facing at this point. Does that mean that everybody is going to stay on the dry side? No, it doesn't. But again, it serves to kind of put a cap on where things can go for production this year, because there still are some pretty big areas of the Corn Belt that are going to have some problems to work through with conditions presenting themselves as they are. Is the Pacific doing anything? Well, right now the Pacific, right in the equator region, is basically neutral on temperatures. You have a little bit of some cooler water here west of South America, but you also have a little area of some warmer water that's trying to develop here in the last couple weeks. So the Pacific temperatures are basically near neutral. The SOI, the Southern Oscillation Index, the barometer comparison that is used between Tahiti and Darwin, and that's used to kind of classify how the atmosphere is acting in the Pacific equator region. That's basically neutral. In November, that value was a +3.8. December was a -7.4. January was a -0.3. The last 30 days, -6.6. 90 days, -4.5. And yesterday, it was a -0.9. There is not really anything on a consistent basis going on to either indicate El Nino or La Nina. One of the terms that's given to a neutral Pacific is La Nada. And that's the only way I was able to pass Spanish. But with a neutral Pacific, that sets up some scenarios for this summer that we're going to go through. And this is the forecast from the International Research Institute for Climate and Society at Columbia University in New York. And the general forecast, looking at this bar graph, the green is for neutral, and you can see that there is widespread consensus for basically a neutral Pacific during the growing season. There's a lot of the forecast models are in that neutral category for the growing season. What does that mean? What does that mean as far as our weather patterns are concerned? And this is where we again say things look better, they look more promising, but not just completely helping the whole crop scenario out to the extent that we have heard discussed. We looked at years when we were coming out of a La Nina like we did last year, and then what happened the following year when the Pacific went to neutral like it is. And in those years, the temperatures over the spring and the summer are quite mild. So right there you can think, you know, at least I do right now, well, thank goodness, you know, I didn't like 100-degree weather in Omaha any more than anybody else did, and obviously we know what it did to crops. So right there, that's a better scenario for this year, with temperatures generally about 1 degree Fahrenheit below normal. So that's pretty favorable. We know that that can really help the cause. But now on the precipitation, it's a little bit different story. Because in a neutral Pacific year, after a La Nina, springtime precipitation is generally near normal, I would say, across Missouri and over most of the Corn Belt, with some dryness in places like northern Iowa and into Wisconsin. But look at what happens during the summer. Summer, you have widespread below normal. Widespread below normal. So, in thinking about that, that leads to the, obviously, as I noted on at the bottom of this comment, temperatures are going to be extremely important. We don't have, likely will not have, widespread soil moisture recharge going into this crop season across the Corn Belt. And I'm talking Corn Belt wide here. I think that what we have seen in central and eastern Missouri on eastward, I think that certainly is going to help. Northwestern Missouri through Iowa and Nebraska, I don't know so much. You know, that's where the issue really starts to take hold. And again, that does not support, in our view, the kinds of trendline yields that are being discussed. This chart put together by my colleague Darren Newsom shows how trendline has just kind of taken a straight diagonal to the upper right from about 1989, now to around 162, 164, somewhere in there. The middle line, the red line, shows actual yields in the past 20-some years. Then this little thin black line is a chart of the 5-year moving average. And note how this chart, or this particular average, has really taken a turn to the right. We have really started diverging away from trendline yields. And a lot of it has to do with some of the weather and some climate conditions that started to make their presence known here in the last several years. But of course, this past year, the yield was around 123. Where could we be for this year on yields for corn? Well, if you look at the last 5 years, in 2008 we had 154, 2009 that record 165, I'm rounding up. In 2010 we were at 151, 2011 147, and then of course this last year, we just, relatively speaking, we just completely dropped through the trap door at 123. Now, if you look at those, and just for the sake of Olympic averaging, if you take out the high and the low, and then you average the years of 2008's 154, 2010 151, and 2011 147, you come up with around 150.7, just about 151. And I think that's fair. And there are at least a few other private analysts who agree with that. that the low 150s is a pretty good area for the, for corn yields to be looked at right now, considering the way conditions are and the way the forecast is presenting itself. That's a big difference from USDA's 163.6 last week. And that's where there's going to be a lot of discussion over the next several months, obviously. What are some takeaway points regarding production this year? Well, I think that corn on corn, continuous corn, most likely in the eastern corn belt, I would say also here in Missouri, the way things have improved, I think continuous corn is certainly possible. We saw this last year that in dry areas, during that dry year, that corn following corn, the yields were about 35 bushels an acre less than corn in a rotation. So that was a pretty big difference. Irrigation, I put irrigation increase again in the western corn belt, but you know, I've heard it all over the place. I was in Illinois early last month over near Pittsfield, Illinois, and I talked with a young farmer who was working with his dad and uncles in the Quincy area. They farm a place there that they've had for a long time. And in the past 2 years, they put in over a dozen pivots. And I thought, in the Mississippi Valley, you're putting in irrigation like that, so it's going on all over the place. I mean, I'm used to it where I come from. It's impossible to raise the kind of crops that they're talking about without irrigation, but I was not used to thinking about that or hearing about it in the heart of the Mississippi Valley. There are water supply issues in the Southwest Plains already. There are allocation questions going on regarding how much, when to apply it, all that type of thing. What are the crops that are going to be available because of water issues? Trendline yields, I think I've pretty well outlined for you, but we think they're questionable. There still are a lot of concerns about pasture supplies as well. And that's an ongoing issue, especially in the Southwestern Plains, where we've seen herd culling and just quite simply a loss of supply, and that translates then into possible loss of feed usage when it comes to livestock. There's a longer-term feature going on the weather scene that we need to also bring before you. And this is a little bit more kind of out there, but it's very important because this is a real long-term thing that kind of colors what's going on as well. That is what's going on in the Pacific and the Atlantic. The Pacific off the coast of North America, west of California. The Atlantic way out around Portugal. In the Pacific, there is a 10-year cycling north to south temperature comparison called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that went into a cool or a negative phase back in about 2008. So it's going to be with us for a while. And when this feature is negative or cool, and we have an equator Pacific in neutral, this negative Pacific decadal feature, it can act like a La Nina. It can offer some La Nina type of influences on our weather pattern. And as you all know, La Nina during the growing season is not favorable for really supporting a real bumper crop scenario. So that's one thing that's going on. And then in the Atlantic, another longer term north to south temperature comparison called the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation is right now positive. It's in a warm phase, way out here. This four-panel chart shows different relationships of those two features back and forth. In the lower right-hand corner that is highlighted here in the tan, and I'm circling this chart here, this is the scenario that is in effect when the Pacific decadal temperature pattern is negative or cold, and the Atlantic multi-decadal temperature pattern is positive or warm. And the general trend across the Corn Belt is for a drier pattern. This is another longer-term feature that kind of challenges crop production, and it's going to probably be with us for a while. So I think this is something also to keep in mind. And again, and here's the reason why I bring this up, other than to, have you think, well, Mr. Anderson really got around to try to find some things to, make things interesting, didn't he? There's a tangible reason for bringing this up. And the tangible reason is this. I had several email questions last year after the big drought, asking if there was anything that was at all related between the drought this past year and the drought back in the 1930s. Had guys ask me, is there anything that's similar at all? And so I asked some of the researchers at the International Research Office there in New York about that, and I got this response. The response was, we don't have a real active project looking at that right now, but we have noted that the Pacific decadal oscillation being negative and the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation being positive were also in effect during the dry years of the 1930s, as they were this past year. And so this is something that we are going to keep in mind and keep close track of as we go through this season. So this is why I'm bringing this up, to kind of reinforce the idea that, yeah, we had a major event last year that likely is going to possibly be with us for a while in terms of some of the impact that it has. Now, a quick look at South America. Satellite imagery from this morning, a little bit of light rain in southern Brazil. In northern Brazil, in Mato Grosso, only a few isolated showers. Now, they're getting along pretty well with harvest on their soybean crop in northern Brazil. Mato Grosso is 61% harvested right now. Across Brazil, they're about on par with a year ago. They're 27% harvested. A year ago, they were 28%. So that was really quite, that's really pretty good. They're getting along quite well. Now, in Argentina, they are mostly dry, but they had some rain over the past weekend and early this week that have kind of stabilized their crop scenario. They've had a real back and forth year. It was too wet early. They didn't get done planting corn until about 2 weeks ago. I was like to get done planting corn August the 10th, but they've had that back and forth scenario. It was too wet, but it got too dry. They've had some showers now to kind of help things out. And the South America forecast does put some rain back into Argentina later this week. And then in southern Brazil and Rio Grande do Sul, a little bit of rainfall with just some moderate rain in northern Brazil. And with that kind of a scenario, they'll be able to keep harvesting in Mato Grosso because the rains come, things really dry up pretty quick. And so if it's not any heavier than about, an inch and a half total, they'll be able to get along in pretty good shape. We have heard about how Ukraine is going to have a better year for crops this year. They're looking for about a 30% improvement in their wheat crop, for example. And for thinking about, again, looking ahead to this season, their soil moisture supplies are quite good right now across Ukraine. And in China, I've circled the northeastern crop area where their major corn and soybean belt is. And they're looking pretty good, although we know that China, no matter what kind of a crop they raise, will not be able to take care of their domestic demand by themselves by any means. So they're still going to be a big buyer. But at this point, they do have pretty favorable soil moisture supplies. Those are the main points I wanted to bring before you this morning. It's a real treat to be with you. And